Minneapolis is a case study of what an occupation of an American city by the government looks like. The Department of Homeland Security says 3,000 federal agents are now operating within the Twin Cities area. That's Minneapolis and St. Paul. That's more than 5 times the size of the Minneapolis Police Department, which has about 580 sworn officers. We now know, according to a Minneapolis Fire Department report, Renee Good died after suffering as many as 4 wounds from gunshots, 2 in the chest, 1 in the forearm, and possibly 1 to the left side of her head. The Trump administration says her shooting was justified. The only reason we know that's not true is because of video taken by bystanders, which showed us exactly what happened to Renee Good. And in the days since Renee's death, journalists and the people of Minneapolis have continued to record these federal officers. And today, we're going to show you some of that video. Now, some of it is going to be very hard to watch, but it is crucially important to bear witness to what is happening on the streets of America in 2026. All right, in the video that you're about to see of Minneapolis, a federal officer appears to reference Renee Good's shooting death menacingly while confronting a man whose car was boxed in by unmarked vehicles.
This is your warning. This is your warning.
For what?
Stop following us. You are impeding operations. This is the United States federal government.
I live over here. I got to get to my house.
This is your warning.
Got to get to my house.
Go home to your kids. I guarantee you're not going to like the outcome. Go home to your children. It's Sunday.
Yeah, go exactly. Let people go to church.
You did not learn from what just happened? Go home to your kids.
That last might have been a little hard to hear, but one of the last things the officer said was, quote, "Did you not learn from what just happened?" To be clear, it's not illegal to observe immigration enforcement as long as you don't interfere with their work. That same day, a chaotic scene unfolded at a gas station in nearby St. Paul, Minnesota. Video shows a man who's been identified as 27-year-old Orban Serrano being forcefully pulled from his vehicle, pinned down, and dragged across the ground into an ICE vehicle. Serrano had stopped for gas when federal officers approached his vehicle, questioning his immigration status. When Serrano did not roll down his window, officers shattered it. Now, this video is particularly hard to watch, especially toward the end. It starts with Serrano being forcefully pulled out of his car by at least 4 officers. Now, in the bottom center of your screen, you can see Orban Serrano in the tan leather jacket. His body is now limp. Officers are carrying him by an arm and a leg while his other limbs drag on the pavement. He appears to be unconscious, and he's placed in a waiting vehicle. Serrano's family spoke with a local Minnesota news outlet and confirmed that he is alive and being held in a detention center in El Paso, Texas. He told his family that he was injured and he had not received medical treatment. The next incident is another tough watch. On Tuesday, federal officers dragged a woman from her car in broad daylight, even as she tried to explain that she was just trying to get to a doctor's appointment.
I can beat up my police before I'm disabled, so I can go to the doctor up there. That's why I didn't
Two officers then aggressively force her against the car and handcuff her. You can clearly hear her saying she's disabled and she's just trying to get to the doctor. DHS claims she was an agitator who was obstructing ICE operations. She said in a statement that while in custody, she repeatedly asked for a doctor, but was instead taken to a detention center where she lost consciousness. It was at that point that she was taken to a hospital. According to the woman's counsel, she was treated for injuries consistent with assault. Here's another video. Sadly, there are just too many of these. Watch this one carefully, though. Several federal officers pinned a man to the ground. Amidst the mayhem, you will see what appears to be a federal officer repeatedly slamming his knee into a man's face as other officers hold that man down. You will see 5 officers on top of one man while a bystander begs them to stop. Again, this is hard to watch.
Hey! Stop kneeing him in the face! That's his face! Stop it!
On Wednesday, another person was shot by a federal officer in Minneapolis. This time, it was a Venezuelan immigrant. A neighbor told the New York Times that they heard gunshots and saw federal agents swarm the neighborhood using smoke grenades as they tried to get the man to come out of the house. DHS says the man ran from a traffic stop and assaulted the officer who eventually caught up with him. Again, this is the Department of Homeland Security's version of events. We don't have video of this incident, but a Minnesota lawmaker released what they say is a 911 call from the man's wife. In that call, she says her husband was chased into the house and was shot through the door. Protests erupted afterward. Tear gas and flashbang grenades were deployed. During this, a family heading home from their son's basketball game got caught between protesters and law enforcement. The mother says a flashbang grenade exploded and tear gas that was already in the air filled their car. This is what the car looked like afterward. She said her 6-month-old baby who was in the car became unconscious and could not breathe.
He was just like lifeless, like he had like foam like around his mouth, and you can he had tears coming out his eyes. I was giving him mouth to mouth, and I remember stopping and I said, I will give you all my breath till you get yours back, because nobody wants to see their kids like that.
It was hard to hear what she said through her tears, but it was, quote, nobody wants to see their kids like that. The family says the baby is recovering. You might be asking yourself how any of this is legal in America in 2026. In fact, in September, the Supreme Court issued a ruling allowing ICE agents in the Los Angeles area to question and detain people based on what they look like, what language they speak, their accent, who they work for, and even where they happen to be. The ruling was narrow. It specifically pertained to the Los Angeles area, but immigration forces across the country have seized upon it, using it as a license to target people of color, which is interesting because the Constitution actually has a specific amendment, the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits that sort of thing. No one in America, whether born here, visiting, or seeking asylum, or undocumented, should be racially profiled or detained without due process. However, in his concurring opinion, Justice Brett Kavanaugh said American citizens had nothing to worry about. Quote, if the officers learn that the individual they stopped is a U.S. citizen or otherwise lawfully in the United States, they promptly let the individual go, end quote. Just let him go. We now know that this is not the case. These so-called Kavanaugh stops are laying the groundwork for a country where Americans, particularly those of color, are expected to prove they belong. Here is another video.
Let me see your document. You're at the border patrol. What do you mean? I don't have to show you. How do I know you're a U.S. citizen? It can go 2 ways. I can take your citizen or you got naturalized? U.S. You're naturalized? What year?
It's been more than a week since the fatal shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent sparked a national outcry against the Trump administration's extreme immigration tactics. Tensions are high in Minneapolis, where protesters are still taking to the streets despite freezing temperatures, threats from President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act. Last night, a Minnesota district judge ruled that ICE officers cannot detain or use tear gas against protesters who are not obstructing authorities, including when people are observing the agents. Sky News reporter Martha Kellner got a first-hand look at how operations are unfolding in Minneapolis after riding along with a local group that monitors ICE activity in the area. Take a look.
We're riding along with one of them. Within half an hour, we're surrounded by a team of ICE officers. This is our first interaction.
This is your one warning, okay?
Those officers just approached the car and they said if we in this car continue to impede them, that they'll break the windows.
We're going to take you out of the vehicle, and we're going to forcefully take you out of the vehicle. We're going to take you out of the vehicle. You're on camera, okay?
A while later, they're back again. Still, no laws have been broken.
Civil. Joining us now is a member of the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee, UDO, who has been on the front lines of the anti-ICE protests in Minneapolis. Thank you so much for joining us. I have been heartened by folks like you in Minneapolis who, even after Renee Good was shot, right, even after she was shot, who have taken to the streets, who have peacefully protested, who have worked to find ways to protect your neighbors, documented or undocumented, because that is the only way this country moves through this and makes clear to the administration what's acceptable to the American people and the people that live in this country or not. I'm curious what you think about the aggression with which these interactions with ICE agents or CBP sometimes start, because there's usually an escalation, right? But in the video we just saw, with them banging on people's windows and yelling at them, telling them with threats that they're going to break their windows, this seems like they're starting at like 15 out of 10. And I'm curious, the folks that you've talked to, your interactions, the aggression with which they come, it feels like they're not even trying to keep those escalations to a minimum, which is what officers are supposed to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And first and foremost, thank you so much for having me this morning. And, you know, it makes me emotional thinking about your question and thinking about what we're seeing on the ground, because, you know, I think I can't underscore enough how chaotic and out of control these agents are. Just the other night, I responded to the shooting that occurred in North Minneapolis, and my top priority was trying to get medical personnel and a doula through to assist someone who was in dire need, who was pregnant, and they wouldn't let anyone through. And we couldn't even get even elected leadership couldn't get them through. And the observers I was working with couldn't get them through. And I think that's just one example on the ground of how inhumane these agents are. I mean, we're seeing people dragged out of cars who are on their way to the doctor. We're seeing pregnant people not getting any medical attention when they did nothing wrong. You know, we're seeing protesters and observers like myself being brutalized with military-level tear gas. And these agents are not only inhumane, but they're cruel, their tactics are brutal, and they're most certainly not trained in any type of de-escalation. In fact, I think they're trained in escalation only, from what I've seen. And it's just out of control what we're seeing, and it's incredibly violent, the tactics that they're using, and it's a disgrace to the American people.
You would only add that even if people are doing something wrong, they deserve due process, and they don't deserve knees in their back and being snatched out of cars in the way that they are having. I know you agree with that. It's just like all of this has been shocking over and over. Jonathan.
You do. I want to play some sound from other protesters, or the phrasing we learned from Michelle Norris, constitutional observers. Let's play this, and I'll ask you something on the other side.
I'm protesting the invasion that we have in the city.
We didn't fight wars so we could have this happen in America.
I think he's making war on our state in the same way as Venezuela and Greenland.
Sounds like you don't fit the definition of the...
No, I'm not paid to be here like everybody says. What the is that? I gotta work in the goddamn morning, just like everybody else. I'm just here trying to stand up for community, dude. We're all human beings here. I don't give a who you are, where you came from, what color you are. It doesn't matter. This is wrong.
And I wanted to play that because there's something I went to college in Minnesota, so and love Minneapolis. And so seeing what's happening on those streets has been painful for me to watch from here in Washington, but also heartening. And I want to know from you if the reason for my feeling heartened by what I'm seeing is true. It seems as though all of the action that we're seeing on behalf of community members in Minneapolis isn't organized. It is spontaneous. It is from the ground up. People seeing what's happening in their communities and deciding it is not enough to sit at home and watch on television. It is not enough to sit at home and hear the horns honking and the whistles blowing without also getting out on the streets and doing their part to protect their communities. And am I right in viewing what's happening in Minneapolis like that?
Yeah, you know, I think it's so incredibly heartwarming to see the way the community has shown up, despite, you know, it feels like the longest 11 days of our lives in Minnesota. And despite the violence that we have seen and most certainly, you know, following the murder of Renee Good, people still are showing up. And I think it's because, you know, her name is a simple yet powerful reminder that we are good and that our intentions are good and that our people are good. And that, you know, and goodness can still prevail. And we believe that despite everything that's happening. It is, you know, incredibly grassroots, it's incredibly local, the response that we're seeing from folks from all across the spectrum, because I think people understand, I hope viewers at home watching this understand that this fight, certainly for me, is centered on immigrant rights and for us, but it's beyond immigrant rights right now. You know, this fight is beyond us, beyond myself, beyond immigrant rights. It's a fight for our future. It's a fight for our lives. If they're pushing the envelope and pushing people to concede their people power to this authoritarian government, they're just pushing the envelope and testing the grounds on what else they can do in other states across the country, violating anyone's rights who pushes back on the government for anything, despite your politics, despite who you are. So it's a watershed moment for our country and for our movement. And people understand that on the ground in Minnesota, and that's why we're fighting back despite what the violence that they're perpetuating.
You do. Thank you so much for your time and your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right, so time and time again, Trump promises his base no more wars, less foreign intervention, and an America First focus. Yet time and time again, he does the exact opposite, and they keep falling for it. Critics now say his imperialistic approach is a defining feature of his second term, with Greenland, a self-governing nation within the Kingdom of Denmark, just the very latest example. This morning, Trump announced on Truth Social that starting February 1st, Denmark and 7 other European nations will face a 10% tariff on every product sent to the U.S. due to their opposition to American control of Greenland. Those tariffs would jump to 25% on June 1st. Meanwhile, thousands of protesters in both Greenland and Denmark took to the streets to denounce Trump's tariff threat, as well as his attempt to take over Greenland. Christina Greer and Susan Del Percio are both back with us. So can we dispel the notion of America First as like a governing philosophy and ideology of Donald Trump? I mean, this is a person who shapeshifts what America First means.
I don't think it was ever American First for Donald Trump. It was me first.
Fair enough, but he convinced millions of voters that he was going to be
anti-intervention.
That he was anti-intervention. He campaigned on no more new wars.
Listen, I agree with the messaging. I was just being perhaps.
No, fair enough. No, I agree with you, but I guess because you are a Republican whisperer, do people in the Republican Party at different levels feel that they have been conned by a man who campaigned on a promise to end wars, no more military intervention, spoke out clearly against regime change, only now to bomb countries and threaten European allies and not even rule out the threat of attacking NATO members?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question.
They feel they've been conned.
Yeah, there is a group of people. That's what happened. Trump put together one of the craziest coalitions of people. Like, he had something for everyone. And sometimes they were at ends with each other, at odds with each other. But that's what happened. So you have, like, when he bombed Iran. Now, you could be for it, against it, whatever, but there were certainly Tucker Carlson, for example, went ballistic. You had a lot of influencers, no pun intended, sorry. But you had other people from that coalition being like, "How could he do this? He promised not to do it." They don't love everything that he's doing for Israel. Now you're also going to have, if you're looking at Greenland, I think that's actually where the mainstream Republicans start to really lose it, because if he does anything like that, if he goes into Greenland, he's destroyed NATO. That's what's at the table. Now, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be with a bomb that you do that. It doesn't mean you turn your back on NATO. Just going and trying to take over another country. Oh, wait, he did that earlier this month, didn't he, Venezuela? Like, once you do that, you blow up the whole alliance. So that will have huge ramifications that I think more from the moderate side. So this coalition that he put together, he really, going back to what I said earlier, it's all about him, and he doesn't care. He wants to see what he can do. He is not trying to use this as a great policy-wise. And by the way, you know who's going to have a real problem with this policy in Greenland? Are Republicans up for re-election, because it may go 10% may go in 21st on or initially, but on June 1st, 25% tariffs. Guess what? That's going to blow everything up for those Republicans.
Well, that's why we have lawmakers who are traveling to meet with officials in Denmark to try to make things up. But the truth is, one of the things Donald Trump has kind of done is expose how little Congress can and will do in this moment. So I'm not sure they're taking.
They won't do it.
Well, you're right. I'm curious, though, because you sort of raised the prospect there, Susan, of like the possible destruction of NATO if this military action is taken. But they're already sending troops there. There is a sense already that European partners need to find or reform a sense of alliance now. They already feel like the United States has put a middle finger in their face. So, Christina, do you think actually we've already messed up NATO?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this time and time again with European leaders meeting without us, right? And I don't know how many years or how many presidents, if we survive Donald Trump, and that's an if these days, how long it'll take us to reestablish our relationships with our allies. I mean, when we have the leaders of the UK and France and Spain and Germany and Ireland deciding we actually have to have meetings because we need adults at a table and not erratic, spontaneous policy based on the whims of someone who obviously, at the end of the day, is for his own economic and personal gain, but just vendettas and, just real revenge of certain individuals for just his own personal gain. So this idea that we would invade Greenland, and don't forget, during the campaign, he said it, and of course, lots of Republicans were like, oh, he doesn't mean it. He's just, he was just throwing it out there. And he obviously does. And so it'll take us years to try and walk back the damage that is done. First of all, we're in Venezuela now, a smooth 25, 30 years just from this intervention from last week. So I think the danger still is unseen because Donald Trump has shown that he can't be a trusted.
Especially since you had Biden, who they thought, okay, we got back to normal, and then this country said, oh no, we don't do normal.
We don't do normal.
So now you had that trust, and then it got blown up again.
Yeah, and they're not just meeting with each other; they're also meeting with China. There's been a nice parade of foreign leaders meeting in China for the first time in like 7 or 8 years. But Christina Greer, Susan Del Percio,
we didn't even
so
get to
much.
the Board of Peace.
We didn't get to the Board of Peace. Maybe tomorrow. We'll see. Thank you so much for joining us.
Today, fresh concerns around the stability of the NATO alliance and American interest in Greenland. Danes rallying in the nation's capital of Copenhagen earlier today in a show of support for the people of Greenland. But this morning, President Trump announcing he'll place new tariffs on European allies until a deal is reached for the U.S. to acquire Greenland. This as he dodged a question from MS Now on possible U.S. military action.
President, pull out of NATO if it doesn't help you acquire Greenland. If it doesn't lead the way.
Well, we're going to see. NATO has been dealing with us on Greenland. We need Greenland for national security very badly. If we don't have it, we have a big hole in national security.
You commit to not militarily.
Sorry, guys, you cannot push too much.
I don't talk about that.
Let's bring in former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and MS Now International Affairs analyst, our friend Michael McFaul. So, Ambassador, we have heard denials from Danish and Greenlandic officials about Russian and Chinese assets on or around Greenland. What was the situation when you were U.S. ambassador to Russia? Does Russia have assets on the island? Has Russia ever recently seriously considered taking over Greenland? Does President Trump have reason to say, as he has repeatedly, the U.S. needs Greenland for national security?
No, 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 no.
Okay.
This is the dumbest idea that I can ever remember, both in working on foreign policy or as a student of foreign policy. And I have studied American foreign policy since the 18th century. This makes no sense whatsoever. If there were threats, there are no assets there, first of all. But, look at the map you just showed and you look at the water and you think, well, where might Russian subs come from? Where might Russian ships come from? Of course, they're up there, but we don't need to annex Greenland to protect us against those. And by the way, I'm glad you have this map. Look at some of the other countries that are up there. They're all NATO allies. So if we annex Greenland and blow up NATO, we lose access to all those other bases, all those, you might not be surprised, we might have intelligence assets in all those other countries up there that are members of the NATO alliance. It just makes no military sense whatsoever. Second, I dealt with Greenland, by the way, when I worked at the National Security Council, responsible for Russia. We have an agreement with the Kingdom of Denmark, goes now back to 1951. We can put as many soldiers and bases there as we want if the goal is really national security. But the goal is not national security. The goal is a vanity project for President Trump. He wants Greenland to become Trumpland so that he will be remembered in history as the guy that expanded the United States of America. And we just have to stop this idiotic idea that negative consequences of blowing up NATO, the most enduring, powerful alliance in the history of the world, to put a few bases in Greenland it is, in my view, it's the worst foreign policy idea that I can ever remember in American history.
And again, you just said that if we want to add military bases there, Denmark, Greenland are going to say, green light, go ahead, do it.
Absolutely. They've been crystal clear. We have an agreement. Greenland is in the NATO alliance, everyone. Greenland is part of it. And look at those other places there, right? Canada is in the NATO alliance. And so this idea to coercively take one piece of the alliance and then all those other countries in your circle will leave the alliance, it just makes no sense. It's just so kooky. And therefore, you have to look for other explanations. And I don't have any evidence to support this, just an opinion. I want to be clear. But it reminds me of this ballroom. Nobody asked him to build that. He didn't pledge to build that when he was a candidate. And this is now something he wants personally. He says we need it very badly. Well, why didn't he say that when he was president the first time around, by the way? We don't need it very badly. We can do everything we need in terms of national security without annexation. And I want to underscore one more point. It wouldn't just be blowing up NATO. It would be America going alone in the world. We would become an imperial power, just like the Russians, conquering territory. And the whole world that believes in international rules would pivot in a different direction. And I worry 20 or 30 years from now, we'll be alone and everybody else will be more united, playing by some rules-based international system. That just is not in America's national interest.
Danish and Greenlandic officials, they were not buoyed at all from the talks with Vice President J.D. Vance. And now we have, in addition, European nations sending more NATO troops to Greenland in response to all this. So given Trump's previous comments about U.S. membership in NATO and you studying him over the years, what could the EU, Denmark, or Greenland say to deter Trump? I mean, do these new tariffs show the only response Trump will accept is to appease his request?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I don't know the answer exactly because President Trump's rather erratic when it comes to these coercive things. He threatens things, he brings tariffs, and then he plays a game of chicken from time to time like he did with the Chinese, and he backs down. But I would say a couple of things. First of all, there's a paradox here that Trump is sanctioning these countries for sending soldiers to Greenland. I thought the whole purpose was we're supposed to defend Greenland with NATO soldiers, right? So there's a real contradiction there. Secondly, I hope that there can be a prolonged, drawn-out process. They pledged to set up a working group. I hope that working group meets for years and years and years, and then eventually the clock runs out. And the third thing I hope is on our side. I hope every presidential candidate, especially in the Democratic Party, makes clear today that if this goes forward in some manner, either through a coercive way or not, they will reverse it. And I think the world needs to know that just because President Trump wants to do something today doesn't mean that it will be permanent. And I think that would be very useful because the polling is really clear. The American people don't support this. By a 4-1 margin, they don't support this at all. They want the president to go back to what he promised him as a candidate. The price of eggs are more important to the American people, not seizing Greenland. And I just want to point out, this will be costly for us. Even if it's done as a contract, we're going to have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to take Greenland when we could be using that money for other things right here at home.
Okay. Ambassador Michael McFaul, grateful for your analysis. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.